All right, we're recording, so I'm going to have Jeff go ahead and take it away.
Hi, everybody. Cole, do you want to do intros first? All right, I'm Jeff Conley, and I'm the fiscal monitor assigned to the CTE program, Career and Tech Ed program, and I've probably met a lot of you before. I've been here for almost 2 years now with USBE, and what I do is I do an annual review. I do monitoring to make sure that the maintenance of effort requirement for the state CTE add-on funding, make sure that MOE requirement is met by all the LEAs. And I think, first of all, I just want to mention, if you don't already know about these resources, the Career and Technical Education funding page on the website is a great place to go and get a lot of documents you may need, numbers you may need, description of the process, that type of stuff. And I will show you that here in a minute. I'll just navigate to that real quick. So in case you're not familiar with that, you'll know where to go to look some things up that you may need. State CTE funding is a restricted funding source. So it's state funds coming to you for your schools to help pay for the added costs of instruction for your existing career and tech ed programs. And there is a maintenance of effort requirement for all this funding, and it's calculated a little bit differently than other MOE requirements. So what happens is the amount of state dollar funding that schools received is really based on CTE course membership that's reported annually through the state UTREX data clearinghouse system on June 30th annually. So we look at like what was reported for average daily membership in CTE courses, and then Wendy Morton uses that figure and says, okay, we're going to base the next upcoming school year's maintenance of effort on that previous year's average daily membership. So for instance, the reported CTE course membership for the 22-23 school year is what's going to be used as a basis for the MOE for the 23-24 school year, if that makes sense. Yeah, and if you have any questions, please do ask anytime. So as I mentioned, state CTE funding is used to support the additional cost of CTE instruction in programs, and they're considered restricted funds, so they can really only be used for CTE instructional costs in grades 9 through 12. And they come with that annual maintenance of effort requirement as defined under Board Rule R277-911-4. So that's a good one to be familiar with if you've never went and looked at that. That really spells out the maintenance of effort as well as other requirements for this state add-on funding. And basically, to be eligible for these CTE add-on dollars from the state, schools have to agree to first expend the regular WPO for the approved CTE programs grade 9 through 12. So basically what the rule is saying is you need to spend X number MOE amount of dollars first using unrestricted or local funds to maintain, say, well, we put this much effort into it of our own funds. Right now we're eligible for this additional funding for our additional CTE costs. So the annual, the magical MOE dollar amount that it's going to be different for every LEA because it's based on the prior school year's average daily membership in CTE courses. And that could be found on the CTE maintenance of local effort spreadsheet. And I will show you that spreadsheet. It's located under the state allocation table section of the CTE website. So let me just show you that real quick. I know a lot of you probably already have seen this, but it may be helpful for others, I think. Okay, so this is just the USBE general website. And so if you come down here to departments and programs, select that, then you can go down to the career and technical education specific page. Once you're on this page, I think this is the tricky part. A lot of people have trouble finding this stuff, but you have to go to this little hamburger looking menu, I guess they call it that. Click on that and it gives you all sorts of options. And what a lot of BAs end up going to is this funding link right here. I'm going to click on that. And then you have information based, your federal funding, like your Perkins stuff, state funding stuff, and then other resources. So go over to state funding, tells you, pretty much says what I was just saying, what rule covers the maintenance of effort requirement. You know, you can read a little bit about like why it's required and where you go to find out more about it, the specific rule. But what the report that I'm talking about, if you come down here to the state allocation tables, you go to the year in question. So for instance, for this school year, the 2023 school year, we would go and we'll be looking at this, but really 2023 isn't done yet. I'm going to go ahead and look. I'm going to go ahead and take you to this one for fiscal year 2022 and come down here to the CTE maintenance of local effort. So this has all been calculated. Let me make that a little larger. This, Wendy Morton has already calculated this and put it out there. You'll want to go and look and see what your LEA's requirement is for every year. So find the right year, let's say, okay, for the FY22 school year, this over here is my MOE requirement. So the MOE is over in this column, minimum qualifying expenditure. And the way that this is calculated is, as I mentioned before, you guys reported your school year 21 average daily membership. You recorded membership for those CTE courses, and that's this number right here. And then the legislature came up with this. This is the WPU value for that particular year. So your average daily membership times that WPU value, so per WPU is what's going to equal this. So that's going to equal your actual MOE. So be able to get to this document here, come down, it's got all the LEAs, find wherever you are, go over there, and you can see for FY22 what the MOE was. And then let me also, let me go back a little bit here. Let's see, just a sec, sorry about that. Let me go back and say, okay, for 23, for this FY23 school year. So if you go to maintenance of local effort here, this, as you can see, doesn't say final, it says mid-year update. So there is an initially, soon after one school year ends, there's an estimate of this amount, so we can thus estimate MOE. So that first initial estimate that comes out right after the prior year end, or right after that prior year's end, it'll give you a very rough figure, but it's basically just based on last year's MOE. So you look for this mid-year update, which comes out in, well, this came out in November. That's going to be either dead on or super close to what the final MOE figure is, even though this isn't technically the final one. You'll see the final one coming out here probably this week. But it's going to be real close to what these figures are right here. So if you guys ever have a question, what your current school year's MOE requirement is, please, look here, and then also give me a call if you need to, or call Wendy Morton or email us. We want to make sure you know what that figure is so that you can hit it, because it's one of the program requirements. Let's see here. I'm gonna stop sharing for a sec. Does anyone have any questions so far on that?
We do have one question in the chat. It says,
Okay.
is the MOE information due once a year?
So yes, so the schools through the data clearinghouse, they report their membership in courses basically in they get that all wrapped up and sent in by soon after the school year ends, and then we take all that data. So whatever was reported at that time by the LEAs, that's what we're going to use and say, okay, we have Jeff McDonald in our office who takes all those course hours and says, this is what we're going to use as our official course hours from the LEAs that they've reported for the year. So yeah, that reporting of hours, that is the final reporting of hours for the year, is what we base this on. Does that answer the question? I think it did. Yeah, so we went through like how the MOE is calculated. So let me know if you guys have any question on that. Oh, go ahead.
There was a follow-up question to that. It says, then all that is required annually is ADM.
Yeah, so I would refer anyone with specific questions on reporting for membership enrollment reporting to and I'd be glad to get you in touch with them too, to speak with Wendy Morton or Jeff McDonald. And if there's any questions on what and how often to report course membership, they would be the people that can give you specifics on how and when to do the reporting. That's a good question. Okay, so USB eCTE, generally me, monitors CTE add-on dollar recipients annually to ensure that MOE requirement is met. And so it's usually around January when we get the finalized FAPR information, specifically the Schedule C on the FAPR. We have that finalized information that our fiscal operations have gone through and said, yep, this all looks right, so go ahead and use it. That information shows us the reported CTE program revenues and expenditures. So we look at that and we say, okay, does it look like you met the MOE requirement? So basically we're saying, did you first of all expend this amount? And then we'll also look and say, okay, you spent it. Now, also the amount that you spent to meet MOE, that amount has to have been funded by either local or unrestricted funding sources. And we can tell that by looking at the FAPR. It's not always real straightforward, but if we have questions, then we move on to the next part of the process and start working with the LEAs and say, okay, something looks weird here. Maybe actually there can be a number of reasons why when we look at that, we'll say something doesn't look right. Maybe MOE wasn't met, or we're just not sure. First of all, the data could have been incorrectly input. The UPAFS upload might be a little bit not what it should have been. And a lot of times, we see LEAs working with the fiscal ops people to correct that stuff. They have a certain amount of time they can correct their UPAFS upload, work with them to make sure that the true revenues and expenditures for CTE programs are shown. And so if something doesn't look right on the FAPR, we have questions, we'll work with probably you guys as a group the most, also the CTE directors, to ask for supporting documentation from your financial system that we can look at and say, okay, show us, these documents that will tell us exactly what types of revenues, what revenues came into the program, and what were the total and different types of expenditures in the CTE program. Sometimes an insufficient amount of CTE expenditures were funded by unrestricted or local sources. Like you've got plenty of CTE expenditures, but the MOE dollar amount, that amount wasn't funded by unrestricted or local. Only a portion of that MOE amount was funded by unrestricted or local. So that's an issue because an entire MOE amount has to have been funded by unrestricted or local sources. Another thing that happens sometimes is LEAs may include in their MOE program expenditures some items that are expressly disallowed under the board rule and under the program. Some things that come to mind right off the bat and cause a little issue are the rule says you cannot use any work-based learning, college and career awareness, or comprehensive counseling and guidance expenditures to meet MOE requirement. So those, whatever happens in those programs, that has to be kind of backed out of your MOE. Hey, I'm going to include this in my MOE expenditures. Those don't count. And you can look at the rule and there's specific language that indicates that they don't count towards meeting MOE. And then one other thing that happens is LEAs don't know their correct MOE amount for the year. Either they didn't know where to go find it, or they're looking at prior year's spreadsheet, just like the one that I showed you. They're looking at the wrong time period spreadsheet, so they got the wrong MOE amount. Make sure you get the right amount there. And we can help you with any of this stuff if you're not sure about it. If you just want to make sure you're doing it right, that's exactly what we want you to do, is to call us, contact us first. We're here to help you comply. I feel like that's pretty much my job, is just to help figure out if there is some area where we're having some issues, and we want it to end up being done perfectly. I guess that's my goal. So I want to help you guys to make sure that's done, because that helps us when you do it right too. Yeah, so generally, because the prior fiscal year, it closes before we really get a chance to do our review for MOE. So sometimes if I say, well, you are short on MOE, sometimes it'll require an additional in the next accounting period, not in the one that's closed, but in the next accounting period, LEAs may have to put up a little bit more local or unrestricted funds to cover the shortfall. That does happen sometimes, but most of the time we have LEAs meeting their MOE. And I know it's different. That's pretty much an overview of MOE. I know it's different than how other MOE is calculated, but maybe that makes it a little bit tricky too, because you have to remember that it's different than, say, how SPED is done, or one of those. So are there any questions on any of that?
We did have one more in the chat. It said, if we haven't heard anything, does that mean that we are in compliance? That's
a good question. And yes, it does. That means it looks to us, based on what we see in Schedule C of your FAPR, that you did meet MOE for the year. And then what I do, if anything pops up where I'm wondering whether it was met, or it's fairly clear that it wasn't met, I send out a letter to you all and your CTE directors and say, this is what I'm seeing. Let's schedule a time to meet and talk about this. And most of the time it's something that we talk through and it gets sorted out and fixed rather quickly. So that's kind of our process. But yeah, we I guess no news is good news on that. We'll only contact the LEAs that we think may not have met MOE. Yeah, so I guess that's it in a nutshell. There's I mean, the actual process for our monitoring is pretty detailed, but yeah, if you all have any questions about how it's calculated, how you find your LEA's MOE, what you need to do if you think you didn't meet it, any of those type of questions, please either give me or Wendy Morton a call or an email, and we'll work with you. We're happy to do that and help make sure that you're on track.
Thank you, Jeff. We appreciate it.
Yeah, you bet.
Okay. All right. Next up, we have Tammy, who's with the title program.
Hi, I'm Tammy Long, and I'm going to try to share this, we hope. I've been with you did it work? Okay, I've been with USBE for about 4 years, and I do the title monitoring. And if you don't hear anything about maintenance of effort, you've done a good job. Yeah. Let's see. Okay, so for Title I, we're looking at 2 years worth of information, and there's 2 criteria we look at. The total non-federal expenditures, and like I said, it's 2 years, and then it goes in and does the comparison for the 2 years, or there's a per pupil amount. So we're looking at both of those criteria when we put the information into our spreadsheet to figure out the MOE. So it's what you spent. And then this second slide shows which funds we're looking at. And this is what the LEAs report to USBE. And we take those expenditures and revenue and we calculate it all out to figure out the MOE for each LEA. And then to fail MOE for Title I, you have to fail both of those criteria. And if you fail to meet MOE, your current grant would be reduced. But before we would reduce it, we would notify you and we would have a conversation. And I've never failed anybody so far. So I think y'all know what you're doing. The one thing we do have a problem with when we go out to visit the LEAs is they need a policy and procedure for maintenance of effort. This is where you need to say, I mean, you should have like a section for SPED for all of these different things for title that says, this is where I go to get my information. This is what's uploaded, what systems you're using. And so that, the next person can see how things were done and what's happening. And then it kind of just covers your end in case somebody doesn't show up for work one day. Does anybody have any questions for me? Oh.
I don't see any of the chat. You can feel free to just unmute and ask as well. If there's anything, that's fine.
And feel free to email anytime too, but like I say, I haven't had to contact anybody, so I know that everybody knows what they're doing. They probably just don't have a policy and procedure in place.
All right, well, if that's all you have and it doesn't look like we have any questions, we can go ahead and move on and turn the time over to Corey Erickson, who is from SPED.
All right. Let's see, Tammy, can you unshare?
No, I don't know how.
Mine is down on the very bottom, or you switches from share screen to unshare, I think, or something like that. Next
It's
to
not
the,
showing me the bottom of the screen.
oh,
Um,
I'll just pop off. How's that? Maybe.
Hey, Tammy, hit escape on your screen to minimize it, and then there should be a button at the bottom that says stop share.
I can see it in my little icon, but it's not coming up. Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Actually, Corey, you should be able to start sharing and share over her.
It says I can't do it while she's doing it.
So Tammy, do you see a little green thing at the top of your screen, a little green bar that says you're viewing Tammy Long's USB screen?
No,
No, you don't see that. Well,
I'm just gonna exit out maybe. Won't even let me do that.
let's see if I can do this and that'll work. There we
Okay,
go.
there we go.
All right. So let me put it back so you can start sharing. All right, Corey, hopefully you can share now.
Okay, everyone seeing that there?
Yes.
All right. Just, we did some introductions there, but briefly on the fiscal monitoring. So we're under the financial operations organization. We have the fiscal monitoring team that Cole Shakespeare is the manager over all the different programs for fiscal monitoring. And we have Neil Stevens on the call here today also, who's the special education fiscal manager. And so there's two of us really right now, myself, that's a fiscal monitor, and then Matthew Nye. And then we also have Jerry Rogers, that's not under fiscal monitoring, but does a lot of the fiscal work that I'm sure a lot of you have worked with on the grants and some of the other programs there. Today, I thought we'd go over, so this is special education, maintenance of effort. We'll talk about some of the principles associated with that, the calculation methods, and then some of the exceptions associated with that. And there's two different standards that we work on regarding maintenance of efforts. One's an eligibility standard, and then one's a compliance standard. And the eligibility is more of at the beginning of your grant period or at the beginning of the year is where you're budgeting sufficient amount of funds for special education from state and local funds. And USBE has decided to use the grant application. So when you're doing your grant application for FTFL, those applications, it has that MOE section. That's what we use for your budgeted amounts, just to make sure that you're aware of what your MOE amounts should be and that you're budgeting sufficient funds for those. Obviously, those can change during the year, but this gives us an idea, and it meets that eligibility requirement that is part of maintenance of effort. The other piece of that is the compliance standard, and that's what we're going to be talking about today, is the compliance piece. And compliance can be either calculated by the LEA or it can be done by the SEA, or Utah State Board of Education. And currently we do the calculations for that, but it's something that we require everyone to look at their budgets and monitoring it as they're going along. But we're the ones that have been pulling the data and populating that and providing that to the Department of Education on an annual basis. So talking about the principles, some of the principles which you're going to be familiar with is, special education costs more than general education, which I'm sure you're all aware of that. Another principle is that state and local resources must be used to support special education. And so kind of the logic I see on that is the federal government says, hey, if I'm going to give you money for special education, I want you to have some skin in the game also, that you're providing special education services through your local funds or your state funds. And to do that, I'm going to require you to spend the same amount of local or state and local funds for those special education year over year. So at least meeting that. And that's where that maintenance of effort comes in. The other principle is that students with disabilities receive general education first. So they're a general education student first and should be receiving services and receiving all the same standards that, you know, general education students receive. And that it's really only those expenses that are incremental, that are unique to provide those special education services for those students is where the special education funding is to be applied. And the federal government, they talk about, you know, that it's supplementing, it's not supplanting. So if you received a larger grant of federal special education funds, they don't want you to then be reducing how much state or local funds you're going to be spending because you just suddenly got these this large increase in federal funds. They want it to be supplemental to what you're already expending on special education. And again, the regulation that we're adhering to, that the maintenance of effort is the 34 CFR. The 300 series talks about maintenance of effort is what we're complying with. There's, for the calculations, there's 4 different methods that we use. I'm going to move this screen over. So there's either the measurements, and you only have to meet one of the 4. So either your local funds that you're maintaining the same maintenance level, state and local funds combined, or the per student. So taking your local funds divided by your students with disabilities for the per capita there, or your state and local, and dividing that by the number of students with special education. So each one of those are a different test that we look at, but you only have to meet one. If you meet all 4, that's great. But each year, only one of them has to be met. And it can vary from year to year as to which one that you do become compliant on. So just take an example here. So on the calculation, so for this one here, for this LEA in 2016, we'll say it was their first year, they spent $500 from local funds. They spent $950 for the combined state and local funds. And then assuming they had 10 students, that made their local per capita at $50 per student, or $95 for the state and local. And that was the first year, so that becomes the new high water mark for them. That becomes the threshold that you're trying to meet. So in 2017 fiscal year, for local funds, they only spent $400. Since that was below the threshold amount of 500, they did not meet that year. So you'll see the stars on here. That means the years that they did meet. So for the state and local, if they spent $950, that matched. So that became the new threshold, or it stayed at the same amount, but for the new year. Their local funds per student was only $40, so that criteria did not meet, and then $95 for the combined, and that one did meet. And then looking at fiscal year 18, so we have $500, even though it's more than the 400, that's not why they met. They met because they matched the high threshold amount of 500. So if you're looking at the $500 amount here, that was the threshold that they needed to meet. State and local was only $900, so they did not meet on that one, but their local per student did, but their combined did not match there. To get it to where it's a little more applicable to what you're used to seeing. So this is a screenshot from the letter, your MOE letter that is sent out. So all of you should have received those in the last week or two. Most everybody, I think there's a few that we're still working on. But this is the table in the letter talking about the maintenance of effort. It's formatted a little bit different than the one that we just looked at. This is horizontal versus vertical. So for this LEA in fiscal year 20, that was their comparison year, the last time they had met. And the amount that they were targeting was 71,000 is what they did in 2020. So for fiscal year 22, they spent 77,000. And so that one did meet because they did exceed their comparison amount from 20. Their state and local, they had met last time in 21, and the amount that they had was 563,000. For fiscal year 22, they spent 600,000, so it exceeded their comparison amount. But when we get down to the per pupil for local only, they had not met since 2016, and that 2016 it was $672. Their per pupil amount for fiscal year 22 was only 541. But you'll see that it says a yes with exception. So a couple of items here. The exceptions, which we'll talk about, they had some exceptions that allowed them to meet even though their amount was less. So $541 per student, since they met with the exception, now becomes the threshold amount. So even though it's lower than the comparison amount, their next year's letter will show 541 as the comparison amount. So as you have exceptions, what it does is it can lower your threshold amount that you need to meet by. On their state and local, if you look at their amount, they needed to have over $5,000, but they only had 4,000. And if you look at what their state and local, they met it on their state and local, but yet their per pupil amount did not meet. So the assumption here is they've had an increase in special education students that lowered the denominator so that it only became out $4,000 per student versus a higher amount. So even though they increased their spending because of their higher student count, it lowered their threshold amount of what they had for the state and local. So they did not meet that category. But this table should be familiar, and so hopefully that's helpful as you go through the letters talking about meeting maintenance of efforts. And again, as long as one of these is either a yes or yes with exception, then you've met for that year. And again, those that have yes with exceptions, that amount becomes your new threshold amount that you would be targeting for. Any questions at this point as we're going? Okay. All right. So where do those numbers come from? So as Jeff talked about, we use the APR for special education. So this particular one, hopefully it comes through clear enough. So it's the Schedule B, which I think is like the second tab on the APR. So your Schedule B is for special education. And what we look at is all of the 1200 series, the 1200 programs. So the 1200, so this column, the preschool 1200s and the extended years, the 1200s is what we look at. So to calculate, so if you wanted to look at and calculate your own MOE from the APR, for state and local, we use the subtotal expenditures. So this 10,000, or excuse me, 10 million, 2 million, and 104,000, those three combined is what would be used for your state and local amounts, total amounts. For your local revenue, we would use your total local revenue. So we'd be combining for those three categories in the 1200 programs to come up with your local amounts. I've highlighted the federal restricted. We take those out of the state and local, so they're not included in these amounts here. So it's taking your expenditures, but we exclude any restricted federal funds that happen to show up in the 1200 series for the calculation. So as you look back at this one here, so all the local expenditures was taken from that first line of yellow highlighted items in the APR. State and local was taken from the bottom one, minus any federal expenses that showed up in those 1200. So that gives you an idea of how we come up with the calculations. And that's why we may sometimes have questions about how your reporting or how your mapping is from your accounting system going into the UPEF system to make sure that we're recording all of those expenditures correctly. We've talked about those exceptions. So there's the 5 different exceptions. One is if you had a personnel that had left, and either you were having trouble replacing them, so there wasn't the expenses happening, or if it was like a more senior special education teacher and you hired a more junior one, and there's a discrepancy in pay between the two of them, that's one of the allowable exceptions where you can reduce your maintenance of effort. The second one is if there's a decrease in enrollment, that can reduce your maintenance of effort threshold. This one we automatically do, so I populate that in each calculation, the changes in enrollment. The third one is if you had a termination of an obligation of a student that was an exceptionally costly program, because the student has left or aged out or no longer needs that. And that's another one. The federal government allows an exception. And then termination of a long-term purchase, such as equipment, where you're finally done paying for that, then we can look at those expenses for that year. And then if you did participate in the high cost fund operated by USBE, we're picking up some of those high cost expenses there to help facilitate that. That's an expense that we can take out of that. I would recommend that you look at the exceptions, even if you meet maintenance effort, just to see if we could record some of those there. If you meet maintenance of effort, then the exceptions don't carry forward. But if you've had one of the 4 categories that you haven't met, since 2016, and there was exceptions in each of those years, eventually, if the amounts accumulate, then it would take advantage, which could have happened on that one example that we were looking at there. So it's something to look at as you're reviewing your maintenance of efforts. And if you have any exceptions, feel free to reach out and give me a call on that. Just a reference of some of the USB rules on allowable costs, what's allowable, and then there's some training information that's out there. Also, again, there's my contact information if you need to reach out to me. Hopefully that was helpful.
Thank you, Corey. Neil or Cole, was there anything that you guys wanted to add? Maybe? Okay, they're not jumping on, so I guess we're good. All right, everybody. So that concludes our training for today. You actually get about 10 minutes back in your day. So I hope you get an opportunity to use this for something enjoyable. The whole 10. Anyway, thanks you guys for coming. Thank you for all our presenters. We really appreciate you giving us your expertise on this, and I hope you all have a great day. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa. We'll see you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.